Good evening. It's my proud privilege actually to spend time with a really august panel to discuss the really distressing situation in Ukraine today. I believe this, the situation in Ukraine with the Russian invasion there is really a signal moment, really, in today's global economic paradigm and a political paradigm. It's a war within Europe of this nature, which comes after almost 2 decades of relative stability. And people had started to imagine that war was behind us. To have this discussion, we could not have hoped for a better panel. Ambassador Arun Singh, who was the Indian ambassador to the US, ambassador to France, deputy chief of mission, will help guide us in this discussion. Currently, he is also a senior counselor to the Cohen Group. Ambassador Pankaj Saran was an ambassador to Russia and was deputy security advisor and in the PMO. So he'll have a very good context from the other side. And then one of my favorite columnists, Professor Raja Mohan, who I think is one of the most thoughtful people on security and foreign policy. And actually, more than all that is written about what I should introduce him with, I must say I read his columns with great interest. I have to also confess that Mr. Arun Singh was senior to me in school and college. And I find it particularly embarrassing that despite being fairly senior to me, he looks younger than me, which is something wrong, in this whole equation. And not only in school, he was quite a legend, and his brother is a very close friend. But I want to just set the discussion. And as always, Marut has given me full permission to be as tough with my questions as I possibly can be. So, as we think about what's going on today, there are a set of things that we will need to tease through. The first is, of course, a little bit of context, which this panel would be the brilliant in uncovering. What brought it to such a pass? Why is it that Russia went in? What was it that provoked it to do so? What did they anticipate the response that they got? How, Putin has always been considered to be a very, very smart strategist and tactician. Has he gone off this time? Has he miscalculated? And what may be ways for this to end? What would be the end game here? The other side around this is also what all has the US and Europe done to push this to happen? What brought this about? And when did it start? Did it start in 2014 or 2008? What led to it? And then I also really want to explore, given that there are two members of the Foreign Service here, to put them into a bit of a spot and ask, have we lost the last decade as a country, between 2010 and 2022, in not being able to realign our interests with the geopolitical realities that were emerging? Russia is a declining economic power, a very strong military power, but a declining economic power, and a place where we don't really export very much, we import some oil. The current situation for India, frankly, is quite tough because of this invasion. We were looking in very good shape with our economy. Now, we will see oil prices rise, which will give a push towards inflation. We will see some supply chain disruptions, which will again lead to some inflation. Our divestment program is likely to face a roadblock. There will be some likely currency outflows, which will affect both the rupee and our fiscal balance. And it would not, one would imagine that maybe our interest rates will face upward pressure. At the time when we were going towards a massive infrastructure rollout program with the balance sheet problems of the banks and of large corporates having improved. So we find ourselves stuck in this situation that we are voting with China, UAE, and Pakistan in the UN, which is not the kind of company we are used to keeping. And it will have some impact on our soft power. I mean, just as a completely, a person working in a firm, a global firm, I have had more than 7 queries from different parts of the world asking, how do you explain the Indian position? And while we have good justification, it still is a bit embarrassing being asked to do this. So there is this military dependence that we have, but our economic policy, our economic interests are actually quite challenged with this, and also our soft power. So to help us navigate some of this, I would like to ask Ambassador Arun Singh to first share his thoughts. And, let's try and have, 12 to 15 minutes as your introductory comments. And after that, I will start with the questions. And then, we've got a very senior group of people. I see Mr. Muthuraman and Mr. Madhur Bajaj and Kiran, very august people in there. So if they've got questions, they can post it on the chat, or, Marut, if you can do magic and unmute them, etc., then that'll be fine too. So could I first invite Ambassador Singh to, give us some perspective on what's going on.
Thank you, Janvijay. And I'm delighted to be on this panel with my friend and colleague Pankaj and Raja, and look forward to the intense discussion. You've given me about 15 minutes, so I'll do a hard stop in 15, wherever I am, and initially share my perspective on how I feel things have evolved and the likely implication for us, including in the economic domain. And of course, Pankaj and Raja would add, disagree, or whatever to the perspective that I share. Now, as I see it, in a sense, it started way back in the late 1980s, even before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as that process was sort of heading in that direction, when Soviet Union agreed to the reunification of Germany. And at that time, their understanding was that Germany, US, and NATO had given a commitment that NATO would not expand even 1 inch to the east. Now, there have been various interpretations of what that meant. The Russians interpreted it as no eastward expansion at all, including to countries that were earlier members of the Warsaw Pact. The American interpretation is that no such commitment was given in writing, and the only commitment was perhaps that NATO would not have a formal military presence in what was then East Germany, or not place weapons in East Germany, and there was no commitment beyond that. And there have been tomes and tomes have been written about these varying interpretations. But more than that, power arose vacuum. And as post-Soviet Russia became weak economically and otherwise, in the US and the West, there was a general sense that we had won the Cold War. And victory has consequences. And therefore, they would reorder the security architecture of Europe, keeping in mind the fact that they had essentially won the Cold War. Beyond that, countries in Eastern and Central Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, others, lobbied extensively in the US for expansion of NATO to these countries, because they saw for themselves a threat from the post-Soviet Russia. And they had memories of their being dominated by the Soviet Union. So they were looking for their own security. And they built up lobbies in the US pushing for that expansion. There are also significant immigrant groups in the US from these countries. And when Clinton was going in for his election for the second term, these immigrant groups became very important voting constituencies in key states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And to get their votes also, Clinton and people around him pushed for the NATO expansion to the east. So thereafter, basic push from the US and the West was that NATO would expand eastwards, and the narrative was that this would contribute to stability of Europe. I happened to be assigned in Moscow as a senior diplomat at that time in the second half of the 1990s. And when this decision was taken to expand to NATO to the east, I could sense that for the first time in post-Soviet Russia, there was great anger and anguish towards the West. And there was a sense, immediately after the dissolution of Soviet Union, Russia was working very hard under Yeltsin, some of the leaders at that time, to integrate with the West. They felt that that was the model they had won. They'll try and emulate that model, build a better relationship. But when the decision was NATO expansion was taken, there was a sense that the West sees us essentially as adversarial, and they will never build a European security architecture along with Russia, but against Russia. So the reaction to that started. And eventually, as Yeltsin weakened, it led to the emergence of Putin in 2000. And Putin saw himself for Russia as a leader different from Yeltsin. He wanted to build Russia back, in a sense, to its earlier glory. And he's been quoted as saying that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. He was tested first in Chechnya, when he re-established, with a great deal of destruction, Russian hold there. There is his famous speech in Munich Security Forum in 2007, challenging what the West has done to post-Soviet Russia. And in 2008, when NATO took the decision, under US pressure, despite some objection from the European countries, including Germany and France, that the door would be left open for Ukraine and Georgia to be at some stage brought into NATO. I think the Russians started drawing their red line there, because their argument was that, okay, Central and East European countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, etc., are becoming gradually part of NATO. Reluctantly, they accepted Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, becoming part of NATO because they had become part of Soviet Union only in the framework of the Second World War, not before that. But for the others, they were just not post-Soviet space. They were not prepared to accept NATO expansion. So when they saw that threat in Georgia, they moved to for Abkhazia and Ossetia to essentially become independent for the rest of Georgia, and that closed the possibility of Georgia becoming a part of NATO, because NATO tries not to take in new members who are in some kind of a conflict situation, because then they have to commit to their security. The next battle was over Ukraine, and it was started evolving for some time. And I think in Ukraine, the problem is that there are deep divisions within Ukraine, between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, in terms of the associations they want to bring about. Large parts of Western Ukraine became a part of the Soviet Union, again, only in the framework of the Second World War before that. So there, the link with Soviet Union, the link with Russia has not been the same as in Eastern Ukraine. So there has been a struggle going on within Ukraine, whether to lean more towards Europe, more towards Russia. And so in 2014, where there was a sense that Ukraine was gradually moving towards the European Union, that was when Russia intervened to generate sort of a separatist status of the Donbass, part of the Donbass region, Lugansk, Donetsk, and moved into Crimea. Because if you remember, again, I happened to be in Moscow in 1998, when Russia and Ukraine did the agreement on the Black Sea Fleet. Because the Black Sea Fleet is critical for Russia's power projection that region. And at that time, as Ukraine had become independent, they had to work out an agreement for the presence of the Black Sea Fleet on Ukrainian territory. And it was a wrenching experience for Russia. So the moment they felt this sort of threat of gradually moving to Crimea, take it back to the Russian Federation, because they had been handed over by the Russian Federation or the Soviet Union to Ukraine only in 1953, when Khrushchev had become the General Secretary, and to ensure that the Black Sea Fleet and its presence was protected. So this dynamic was going on all the time. Now the question is, why did Russia take the action it did now, given all that background? One can argue, based on whatever is emerging in the public domain, that one, perhaps Putin felt that the present Ukrainian leadership was once again taking Ukraine more in the direction of the West, and something needed to be done. Post 2014, there had been, although was not any active candidate for NATO membership, there had been more and more security cooperation arrangements between US and other Western countries and Ukraine, and Russia was getting a little anxious about that. Third, I think he judged that US and the West was weak at this point. We've seen the disruption that Trump brought about. Biden had just withdrawn from Afghanistan. And in the US body politic, there is no willingness for another robust military engagement externally. And that is why, even in the context of Ukraine, Biden signaled right at the start that there'd be no US troops present there, although they would take economic action if Russia moved there. So US is seen as weak. US itself is divided. The Trump Republicans have so far been supportive of Putin, so that's beginning to change. In Western Europe, there were groups, especially the right-wing parties in France, in Austria, several other places, even the Hungarian Prime Minister, who were not critical of Putin. So with these and perception of was arrested from his security perspective. Because as he said in one of his comments, with the eastward expansion of NATO, they are at our doorstep. And how far can we move back? Now, I think from the US, the signal was that we would not intervene militarily directly, but we would take steps to make it a very costly operation for Russia. As early as 2nd November, I think the US signaled to Russia that their sense was that Russia was going to intervene in Ukraine. And if they did that, there would be severe economic consequences for Putin and for Russia, the kind of economic consequences that had not been done under any US and Western sanctions so far. I think perhaps Russia judged, or President Putin judged, that the West would not go so far because of the kind of linkages between Russians that were being. Now, be that as it may, the sanctions that we see at the moment are unprecedented in the kind of sanctions that the US has imposed and others. There was an argument that Russia had built up a war chest with $640 billion of reserves of the Russian central bank. A large part of that is now effectively blocked because they're saying they do not allow them to undermine the sanctions that the US and West have imposed. They have frozen the assets of some of the leading Russian banks, and they account for almost 70% of the overall assets of the Russian banking system. They've taken away a large number of banks, Russian banks, from the SWIFT system. Many American companies have stopped their operations in Russia because, and also European countries, because they see a reputational damage to themselves. Many of them, including some of the leading energy companies, BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, have said that they will, stop their investments in Russia and walk out of those over a period of time. So we see a possibility, unless the trend is reversed, of a major decoupling between US and Europe on one side and Russia on the other. Now, there'll be cost for everyone. I was looking at some of the figures. For example, the EU is Russia's biggest trading partner. 37% of EU's trade of Russia's trade is with the EU. 36% of their imports and almost 38% of their exports are with the EU. Russia accounts for 26% of EU's oil imports and 40% of its gas imports. Russia's sovereign debt, almost $300 billion, and a large part, of course, is also in foreign held debt, and about $20 billion dollar-denominated debt, and $86 billion in terms of foreign equity holdings. So there is a significant Russian engagement, and their economy is $1.5 trillion, and more than 40% of the GDP is generated by exports and imports. So for Russia also, there is a very important external linkage that has been there. Now, there would be costs for European companies. I was looking at, for example, EU's trade with Russia is a total of about $202 billion. And $60 billion is Germany's trade with Russia. So 1/3 of EU trade with Russia is accounted for $311 billion. But then when we look deeper, we found that $38 billion euros Germany's investments in Russia, round tripping that is happening. Russian money going to Malta, Cyprus, Luxembourg, and other places, and then coming into Russia. So there is that linkage between Russia and the US and Western economies, and there would be impact on all of them. So now I think from India's perspective, we can see some disruptions happening in the broader global economy. Oil prices are already rising. India imports fertilizer from Russia. There could be some impact on that. We have to see if Russia takes any measures in terms of restricting energy access to different countries, or some of the critical minerals, raw materials, palladium and others that are sourced from Russia. Among the Western sanctions are sanctions on technology, certain technologies being allowed to go to Russia. And it's not just technologies or products going directly from US, let's say, to Russia, but anything that is manufactured anywhere using US design and US technology cannot now be sent to Russia in a manner similar that they had done with Huawei. So we'll have to see whether in terms of what we are getting from Russia, including in defense supplies, would have any impact of that. So that's something, again, not very clear at the moment. So I think in some, we can say that this is an unprecedented situation in terms of economic measures that we are seeing for the situation that is developing. Also, I found from the US experience in the context of Afghanistan, it is easier to go in with an operation and far more difficult to get out. And the Americans were trying to get Afghanistan since 2009 and by Trump. Now Russia has gone in. What will be the peg for them to pull out? And I think that's going to be very, very difficult. What is the point at which they say that they've achieved their objective? And if they're not able to do that, and if things get worse, if there's more and more destruction happening on the ground, then the reputational damage, the pressure on others will only build up over time. So let me stop here for now, and I look forward to the further discussion.
So it's a very good time to come to Ambassador Saran now, given that Ambassador Singh has said going in is easier than coming out, and having been part of the security uh, bureaucracy in India. I would love to start hearing your comments on what you see has brought us to this pass, and how do you think Putin will now navigate the situation that he may or may not have anticipated. Ambassador.
Yeah. Thank you very much, firstly, for inviting me to this discussion. It's couldn't be more timely. So I will take your questions in two parts. One is the Russia angle, and then the second part is on the national security point of view. So on the Russia part, I would like to begin with a few, maybe I'll tailor it in a slightly different way. Firstly, I think we need to also understand what Russia is. I mean, in layman's terms, Russia is twice the size of China geographically. It is twice the size of the United States. It's 5 times the size of India. So that is the scale of this country, which many people sometimes even do not call a country, but a vast landmass of territory, which straddles both the Arctic, the permafrost, and senior Russian officials have themselves told us that almost 70% of their territory has still not been discovered. So we are talking here, when we talk Russia, we're talking of a rather unique country. Ukraine, on the other hand, is the size of France or Afghanistan. So this is the scale of the standoff. Secondly, I was in Russia in 1984, 85. I continued to work on Russia in Delhi. And then I went there as ambassador of India in 2016. And when I reached Moscow in 2016, all the memories of my first tenure 30 years ago came back. And when we looked at our own kind of analysis of how this country had evolved and changed over history, it is actually quite a remarkable story. And at a very simple level, it is the story of an empire which disintegrated and which was defeated by another alliance. And the war was entirely on the basis of ideology. It was a rather simple kind of situation to be in, where after being on the same side of the World War, the paths of the Western alliance led by the United States and the Soviet Empire, they completely separated and they went in radically different ways. It was one of the most remarkable events of contemporary history, where you joined together to create the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council. You were on the same page because you were convinced that as the victors of the World War, you had a God-given right to preside over global security affairs. When this separation happened, it became brutal, it became ruthless, and every single country in the world was engulfed in this conflict, which was military, which was economic, which was ideological. And at the end of the day, in 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up into 15 countries, it was considered to be a conclusive end to the Cold War. And we had one victor and we had one vanquished. And this is the background to which then we saw how Russia evolved from 1991 thereafter. So a lot of what is happening, and Ukraine is on the periphery of Russia. And in many ways, as Indian planners and Indian officials who look at our own situation in our own subcontinent, it is not too difficult to look at what it means to be part of an empire which has broken up and which has led to the creation of two, in our case, and then three countries. And then how do we manage the fallout of a very imperfect division or a breakup of an empire? And the resonance or the aftershocks of the breakup or the disintegration, for example, are being felt by us even 75 years after the event. In this case, it's been only 30 years. So history is still young. Russia, in that sense, the contemporary Russia we see is still a young country. Now, President Putin has been in office for 22 years. An average Russian who's, say, a teenager, or even someone who's 20 years old or 30 years old, that's all he knows about his country or his government. And prior to that, prior to 1991, one of the primary reasons for the eventual breakup of the Soviet Union was the complete stagnation in the ruling apparatus of the Soviet Union, where typically a leader would rule for maybe 20 years or more. And that stagnation actually, and coupled with this very, very ruthless Cold War rivalry, led ultimately to the implosion of the country. So here we have a situation where, having led Russia for 22 years, there is a growing sense within the country of the sense of stagnation, that Russia is not really taking off as people imagined it would. Because once you had passed the barrier of the Cold War, the aspiration was that once you have shed off the baggage, the ideological baggage, and by the way, the contemporary Russia in terms of its politics is totally anti-communist. And it's very difficult to put your finger on what ideology they profess or what ideology is propagated by the ruling party. So, for example, from a time when the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the single and only political party before 1991, today in the parliament in Russia, the communists have got about 4 or 5 seats. And President Putin and his government and the dominant strategic narrative in Russia is extremely anti-communist. But are they capitalist? Are they Western liberal? Do they espouse those values? Not quite. So we have a very, I think, sui generis kind of an ideological arrangement within the country about how they view themselves and what they are. Now, you know, the stagnation of the Russian economy is a serious strategic challenge for Russia. And sometimes it's important to ask, if they stagnated from the 40 years during the 40 years of the Cold War, why are they continuing to stagnate in the post-1991 period? And Western analysts and diplomats have their own thesis about this. They attribute this to the lack of democracy, Western-style democracy, basically, to the absence of plurality, and so on. I am not sure whether this is a complete answer to the problem, but we do have a situation where, in terms of economic growth, there is stagnation. Also, in terms of the diversification of the economic base, it's not a good situation for any economy, especially of the size of Russia, to be so dominant, so dominated by a very narrow economic base, which is primarily raw material, fossil fuel, and the defense industry. So that is another, I think, issue we have here with Russia. Now, when I reached in 2016, Ukraine had just happened. The sanctions had just been imposed on Russia. The value of the ruble had fallen in 2014 from 30 rubles to $1 to 60 rubles to $1, by the end of 2015, and almost like the rupee. And so therefore, because of this foreign exchange devaluation, the GDP of Russia in dollar terms had fallen by half. Now, everyone in Russia was getting used to a new life based on sanctions. In 2014, when the sanctions were introduced, they were done by a Democrat government through an executive order. But in the elections, in the US elections, presidential elections, where there were allegations about Russian interference, and all this led in 2017 to the US Congress legislating these sanctions and converting an executive order into law by the Democrat-dominated Congress. And the purpose was to ensure that the president is not given the powers to play around with the sanctions or to lift them whenever he wished. So you found this law enacted in 2017, and the title of the law itself is actually rather interesting because it doesn't leave anything to imagination. The title of the law is Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. So it is absolutely clear that Russia was an adversary and it would be countered through sanctions. So we had another set of sanctions imposed in 2017. This was not going away for Russia, and it was not going away for the US. Europe was caught in the middle, particularly countries like Germany and France, but there were others also. They have historically, particularly after 91, had a very difficult time, the old Europe, to bring the two extremes within Europe to some kind of reconciliation on how to deal with Russia. So the Russians have obviously given up the Baltics as a lost cause, but there were other and the Europeans have always been very careful not to allow these little tiny countries to lead the European Union's positions or the NATO's positions towards Russia. So a lot of the internal contradictions within Europe have been managed by 3-4 of the larger powers. Now, of course, another fundamental event took place with the Brexit and with the UK leaving Europe. So suddenly you have a situation where the responsibility of governing and strategizing for Europe has fallen on the shoulders of France and Germany. And here, individuals matter. They matter a lot because if, say, Chancellor Merkel was in power for such a long time, she actually had a fairly robust and a resilient channel of communication with President Putin. And we have to keep in mind that in all such cases, for example, where you have a non-elected leader versus democratic societies, the non-elected leader has the privilege of dealing with a series of presidents and prime ministers in Europe and America. So he always has a good measure of his partners and adversaries. This is true not just in Russia, but in many other countries, for example, which are not. And in fact, even in our case, I mean, for example, a dictator in Pakistan would have good measure of successive Indian prime ministers. And they construe the hurly-burly of Indian democracy not as a strength, but as an opportunity and as a weakness. So these are situations which are not particularly unusual. So coming back to Ukraine, so when the 2014 events happened in Ukraine, basically the whole effort at that time was to kind of pull Ukraine away from Russia. And one of the ways to do this was to simply change the president, because the country remains the same, the people remain the same. But if you have a new president, he may take a very different approach to, say, Europe or Russia. You may have one president who says, I want the best of relations with Russia. And tomorrow, if you have a new man in charge, he may say, no, I want I don't like the Russians and I want a very good relationship with Europe. So that's what happened in 2014. And the Minsk agreements were actually something which, as India, we were happy with, because they provided a kind of platform for these differences to be sorted out diplomatically. And am I running out of time?
A little bit. We want to keep some time for the question answer.
Okay. So I would say that for us, I think the problem is that the Minsk system and the Minsk process seems to have collapsed. And today, frankly, the consequences of what is happening are very serious for us in all areas: strategic, economic, military. And we have to go back to the drawing board. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran. It's my pleasure now to ask Professor Raja Mohan, and I am sure he'll build on his Indian the article in the Indian Express. But I hope he will address whether or not India has been sluggish in realigning its foreign policy to its interests.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. It's a delight to be part of this CII discussion on what is today a major challenge to all countries, I mean, including India. It's often said a week is a long time in politics, and we've seen that this week. It's same true of geopolitics as well. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has really, promises to transform the security order in Europe, and not just in Europe. It is going to have severe consequences for Asia. So this is really a hinge moment in international affairs, and we're really at the beginning of that. I want to highlight 5 major consequences. In fact, Pankaj just ended by talking about the consequences. So let me highlight 5 outcomes from this crisis, and quickly in the next few minutes. First, I think, is Russia is a big loser from its attack. And Russia's tragedy, which is just beginning to unfold, must be put squarely at the door of its president, Vladimir Putin. That just a week ago, just before his invasion started, his leverage with the world was at its highest. That is, he has massed troops on Ukraine's borders. You had the German chancellor, you had the French president promising to relook at the European security order, promising to do what they can to meet Russia's demands, and the US too had responded. But by pulling the trigger, Putin has lost all the leverage that he had. That is, as long as you have a threat to use force, you can negotiate and get something out of it. But once you use force, what matters on the battlefield is the actual outcome. So I think that's where we are. And I think there is no way that Russia is going to come out a winner from this conflict. Russia has a huge amount of military resources. The imbalance is real between Ukraine and Russia. But he can continue to flatten more cities. He can take control of the city, but he's not going to win peace in Ukraine or in Europe. So I think this is really where it is going. I mean, I would like to say, both Pankaj and Arun talked about, and you asked them specifically on what led to this. I would like to say the world is an unfair place. It's not an all-sane society. This is where most countries have grievances, have deep historic concerns. But sovereignty is about managing those concerns. And those who can do things, even if it is an invasion, if you can get away with it, people would applaud. Nobody complained too much when Putin took, annexed Crimea. But today, by going in full scale into Ukraine, he's actually put himself and his country, I think, unfortunately, at extraordinary difficulties. So this is going to be a very, very hard time for Russia. And my own sense is that the outcomes in the next few days, I mean, he's strong enough gain control of the city. But this is going to divide Ukraine. It is going to step up international, denunciation of Putin, and it's going to increase the economic pressure on Russians. Some of the effects we're beginning to see. So therefore, I think it's a great tragedy that what Putin has done to Russia after 20 years at the top, and someone who's seen as a genius in calculation and clever statesman, has really utterly miscalculated the next steps in this crisis. And it's a tragedy that Russia has to pay the price for his really, I would say at this point, delusions in terms of what he thought he could achieve in Ukraine. The second outcome is the US comes out pretty successful, a major winner, if you will. I mean, I'm sorry, in this tragedy to talk about winners and losers, but the fact is, thanks to Putin's, miscalculation, he's achieved so many things for the United States. He's united NATO. He's ended German pacifism, which has been a central feature of international politics for 75 years after the Second World War. He's even ended the neutrality of Sweden and Switzerland. That is, it needs a real genius to make Germany do what it promises to do now, put in $100 billion extra for defense, and to invest 2% of its defense every year in the coming years. If you remember, under the Trump administration, it always complained that the Europeans were not doing enough. But today, thanks to Putin, Europe is going to spend more money on defense, and that Americans quite comfortably, they're not involved, their troops are not involved, they're not directly engaged, but they've restored the Western coherence in Europe and have mounted a set of pressures on Russia, an unprecedented set of sanctions that have been unleashed. I don't know if Russia can weather this or not, but the fact is, at this point, the gains for the US, Europe, and the West are significant. And I think these are going to be out there for a long time to come. The third is China. We just signed, as I said, a week is a long time in politics. Just at the beginning of February, when Russia and China signed the statement, all of us thought, this is, my God, this is the arrival of a definitive moment, that Russia and China are now going to overtake the West, which is in decline, and that today, that they will be the new arbiters of the international system. But what Putin has done puts China too in a difficult situation. There is one view which says that actually Russia is going to become even a junior partner to China, and that China's leverage vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis the West, and with India, of course, it's going to mount that given the failures of the miscalculation of Vladimir Putin. But there's a different way of thinking about Chinese situation. If the Chinese thought they can repeat Putin's performance in relation to Taiwan, that the Russia's experience would be a cautionary tale, I think, for China. Unlike the Russian army, Chinese army has no real experience in fighting. If they think they can simply land troops and deal with Taiwanese resistance, I think that might be a mistake. And China has seen the kind of sanctions that the US has done, because the West has even greater interdependence with China. But the fact is, my sense is, more restraint will be exercised by Xi Jinping, because in real world, nobody wants friends who are losers. Because if Putin had got away with this, Xi Jinping would have been on a high, but it doesn't look like Putin is getting away with it. So pressures on China to rethink both, how it deals with the region are going to be quite impressive. And here I would just add, I just talked about German rearmament in Europe. There are hints that Japan's rearmament too would start. In fact, 2 days ago, the Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, has said that Japan should consider deploying American nuclear weapons on its soil. Of course, there's a great no. Japanese pacifism has long, resisted anything to do with nuclear. But just like Europe, Russian expansionism in Europe has triggered a massive reaction. Chinese expansionism too would see Japan's rearmament, a Japan that is going to do more to cope with the Chinese expansionism. So we're going to see at the beginning of, I think, in Asia too, that China's periphery, just as in Russia's periphery, is going to be mobilized in a manner that it will add to the pressures on China. It's interesting that the US has called a summit of the Quad Summit just today. I don't know what time it is taking place. But the fact, what the US is saying, telling the Chinese, don't think because I'm preoccupied with Europe that you're off the hook. I think there's a diplomatic signal that US can walk in Europe and chew gum in Asia, that the US has enough capacity to take on both these adversaries who just 3 weeks ago were preening about their alliance, a de facto alliance. So I think in Asia too, we're going to see the beginnings of a significant transformation where the resistance to China's hegemony in the region would increase. And that brings me to the last set of issues, the fourth set of issues. Mr. Sinha, you asked about India facing the flak. There is a lot of flak. Look, but then as I said, look, the world is an unfair place. I mean, I think India has to be responsible for its security. We're not in a beauty contest. So I think if they say, look, the dependence on Russia for weapons supplies is critical, that India is not going to simply sacrifice to look good, because there's always tomorrow, right? Today, the beauty contest will be over. Tomorrow, there'll be something else. Someday, Russia and the US might do a deal. So India can't simply say, my dependence on Russia does not matter, and I'm going to simply stand up with the rest. I mean, it would have been nice. But why is it that India does not stand up? I think I want to say something controversial here. India has traditionally talked about its strategic autonomy and non-alignment. These arguments were largely deployed vis-a-vis the United States and the West. That is, when we talked about strategic autonomy, we most of the time meant it as keeping some distance from the United States and the West. But what we see and reveal in this crisis is that India's strategic autonomy today is being constrained by the dependence on Russia for weapons and will be further constrained by a deepening Sino-Russian alliance. So you have a nice jugalbandi that might happen to you. A Chinese can ramp up military pressure any day on you, and you go to the Russians for weapons. What more do you want? I mean, that your best friend is also even a better friend to your most challenging neighbor that you have. This is not a nice situation to be in, and this is going to severely constrain India's strategic autonomy. And we've seen our friends in China and Russia. Imran Khan was hosted in Pakistan in the middle of this war. Speculation is that the Chinese were putting a lot of pressure on Putin to host Imran Khan. So if they're going to get away with this, they would like to recruit Pakistan into this coalition, into a regional coalition, which would, if it succeeds, I mean, I think at this point, the plans are all gone, or that we might have even greater problems for India's strategic autonomy. So therefore, the Sino-Russian alliance and India's extraordinary dependence on Russia for weapons is a problem. And I think we have to come to terms with it, because through the last 30 years, by trying to keep Russia on our side, we did not really break from the dependence. But today, that dependence is a problem. Here, I'll conclude by just one thought. This is where CII should step in, I think, that India has enough capability to begin to produce weapons at home. In fact, last Friday, the Prime Minister said, producing weapons in India is a patriotic duty. So my sense is there is a crisis. India needs to get out of this, a locked-in effect that it has with Russian arms, and that the CII needs to step forward with a serious plan for domestic production of weapons. And here, of course, government needs to make the policies, but I think there's also a historic opportunity, I think, for the Indian industry to step in vigorously to offer a plan to reduce India's dependence on Russian weapons. And I think that would be a historic contribution. So I will stop here by saying that my friends Pankaj and Arun talked about, there is an empathy for Russia. In India is deep empathy. I was a former leftist from JNU. We had even greater empathy from an ideological sense with the Russians. But I think Putin has squandered a lot of goodwill Russia has had in Europe and in Asia. And I think it's really utterly tragic to see Russia put in this position by a leader who thought he can just get away with something so outrageous.
So thank you so much. This has been fascinating. And I'm going to come to Meher and Satish. But before that, I'm going to ask a follow-up question of you, Professor. I want to be politically incorrect and say it's a matter of great relief for India that Putin has faced such resistance and in fact may end up, doing so badly that, there's this China, Russia, Pakistan alliance gets weak. Not only that, the space for our foreign policy to actually make a change, the case becomes stronger. The case, I just read a piece by Mr. Ram Madhav in one of the newspapers where he had tantalizingly put is the era of strategic, whatever he used a word similar to your strategic autonomy or non-alignment, is that phase over? So the question is, if you just look at geopolitics on 4 dimensions, what we have talked a lot about, injustices and historical, the past, and depending on which date you pick in history, you run into a different set of grievances. That's one. But then there are 3 other features which are now not going away. If we look forward, not look back. The first is that there are some crises in the world which require global cooperation. Climate is one of them, pandemics is another one of them. They will require global action. There are areas where you will see accentuated competition. The WTO standards you will see bilateral movements, you will see tariffs, you will see, competition which is sharper. And then there is third, an area of conflict which doesn't seem easily resolvable, which is on technology standards, cyber, the quantum computing and sharing of IP and immigration and tax laws, because of the basic nature of authoritarian regimes which will not see privacy and private good, and they will see public good and ability for the state to be intrusive, versus other liberal democracies which will not be able to go that far. In this situation, what would be 3 elements of the same question? How should India untangle and start to go towards its economic interests? Why did it not do a defense deal with France or Germany rather than continue to do it with Russia? Second, how do you see the 5-year term for China? Will it come out stronger because of this or weaker because of this? And third, if you look at the US, how will it view India right now?
You're asking me? Look, I think on the first aspect, look, there's no point looking to the past. India's path dependence on the weapons industry, it's a story, but there's no point looking back. The question is, what can we do in the next 5 years? And this way, as I said, the government has announced a number of steps in recent months, corporatizing the Ordnance Factory Board, inviting private capital, inviting foreign capital into defense production, make in India, and then export. So this is, it is an abstract, 30,000 feet level. These are good policies. This way, I think, I'm not from the industry, but I think you guys should say, look, how do we translate this PM's vision into specifics so that over a 5-year period, because it's not that India has not reduced its dependence on Russia compared to 90%, maybe 80%, 30 years ago. Today is about 50 to 60%. So we have moved, we have diversified, but the dependence, certainly in the time of a war, where we are caught in a war with China, that the circumstances are difficult, but I think because you have to start at some point. There's no point merely saying it can't be done overnight, but the point is we have to start at some point. This is where I think the industry has a huge role. Second, I think in terms of China's position, my sense is Xi Jinping as a strong man, just like Putin, will face problems. That this idea that you are a chairman of everything, you alienated everyone in your neighborhood, and that you can simply get away with it, because I think part of the problem both Putin and Xi Jinping bought into their own propaganda, that the West is in decline, West is about to collapse, look at the US, it couldn't even get vaccination done. I think there's a fundamental underestimation of the capacity of the West. For example, Putin, I think with the $1.6 trillion GDP, that you must be crazy to take on European Union, which is at $15 trillion. This idea, in the old days, we Marxists used to say correlation of forces. You have to deep structural factors that define balance. And I think there's a terrible mistake. Xi Jinping is doing much better, more leverages with the West. But I think he needs to take a fresh look that can he alienate Japan, can he alienate India and ASEAN. We saw Singapore and a whole lot of ASEAN countries voted with the US General Assembly against Russia. It's also a signal to Chinese, don't think you can keep pushing us. So I think the Chinese have a lot of thinking to do after what has happened. Finally, on what the US thinks, look, as far as I can see, look, there is a chatterati, there's a talking heads like me, who constantly going, talk all the time, say, oh, India, what is India? India's collapsed, India's not a friend. A lot of this is, is a Twitter discourse. But if you see one official statement that came from the State Department spokesman, he said, we understand India's position. We hope India uses its leverage with Moscow in a constructive way. So they're not saying, end of the story. The fact that they convened the Quad meeting, when all the talking heads are saying, oh, India's, Americans are going to be nasty to us. They want India. Look, while India can't contribute much to the Russia question, we are still critical for the China question. So it is not that everything is in Europe, but there is Asia. And I think in Asia, the fundamental strategic position US has taken is they need India to produce a balance of power. And there, I think India has opportunity. So I think the question is how best we take that forward rather than that everything, we're not an ally of them. Even the allies don't do it. That somehow we have to be all the time with Americans and say, look, raise your hand every time they say this. We don't. And nobody's saying you have to. So I think there is enough room for working together with the US. And for us, our principal challenge is going to come from China. And there, the partnership with the US is critical. And the US is open to doing more in Asia with us. And I think that's what we need to pursue.
Meher, why don't you unmute and ask? And please say whom you're asking your question to.
I'm not sure who I'm asking the question.
Think about it and be sure and then ask.
Thanks, Janme. A big thank you to all three speakers. I've learned a lot in the last 1 hour. So thank you very much. I have 2.5 questions. If such unprecedented sanctions are imposed, my question is, what more can Russia do? In some ways, as you have pointed out, he has nothing more to lose. So what more can this man do? I know I don't know whether any of us know, but I'm just curious, because a caged tiger can do more harm pushing someone against the wall. That's my first question. And the second is a little bit about, Janme, what you pointed out in terms of climate change. And at this point in time, just when we finished COP26, the new IPCC report has just come out. We are at a very, very difficult point on planet Earth. And we really need global cooperation. With what's happening today, how is all this going to impact the whole climate change issue and the fact that we really need to stick within this 1.5 to 1.7 degrees centigrade and no more? With oil prices going so high, I'm concerned that oil drilling might start again, And so what is going to really happen with climate change? And the 2.5 question is on energy security. In some ways, does this Russian-Ukraine standoff throw a lot of light on energy security for a country like us, which is so dependent on imports of oil? So I don't know who can answer this. I'm sorry, Janme.
Okay, so then let me, as moderator, allocate the question. So the first question, to Ambassador Singh about, what your first question goes to him. Your second question goes to Ambassador Saran, and the half question goes to Professor Raja Mohan. Just helping you out, Meher, what to do. I do this all the time.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Janme. Much appreciated.
So, Janmijay, with your permission, I'll respond to that question and maybe touch on
one or two things that you had raised. And I think in question in terms of has the West done all it can, and therefore there is no more action that could be taken against Russia? No, there's a lot more complication can be done. There's already talk emerging in US of the Congress moving for some kind of sanctions on energy. I mean, the administration has taken some measures. Now the Congress would want to get into the act. The talk about not sanctioning gas, but oil exports, because Russia is far more dependent for its revenue on oil exports than on gas. Europe is less dependent on oil, more on gas. So there are all kinds of arguments out there. The second, they can make it more difficult for Russia on the ground in Ukraine, because there are, and it's not easy. Soviet Union had intervened in Afghanistan in 1979, left in 1989 after having failed completely. And the next step would be to try and make sure that on the ground, bulk of Ukrainians become even more anti-Russian, become more nationalist, and in terms of just military strategy on the ground, try and make Russia fail. And it's not going to be easy for Russia. It's a big country. There are a large number of urban areas, and many of the defense analysts, now nobody knows really how the picture is moving very quickly. Many of the defense analysts are arguing that Russia's military strategy is not working so far. Already, Russia has officially accepted that 500 soldiers have been killed and about 1,500 have been injured. Now, the numbers would be larger. So there is a challenge out there. Now, in terms of your point, Janmijay, I would just say that, look, India has to keep its options open. And it's not a question of either or. Because no country takes decisions to help another country. They take decisions based on their interests. US takes decisions based on its interests and its own political compulsions. And where there is convergence, you work together. But to expect that if you align with the US will always take care of your interests, that is not going to happen. And again, and that's how their system works, and one has to accept it. And also in the US, once they take a decision, and even their European partners have complained, and I used to see that when I was there, once they take a decision emerging either because of the president's whims, in the case of Trump, or through an interagency process, they accept all their partners to fall in line and not question it. You saw that when they invaded Iraq, the kind of messaging they did against France and Germany at that time, or later against Germany in the context of Libya. Again, the US, for example, since that's the hint that is emerging, and of course, we must build with the US. And we've been doing that in a major way since 2000. The relationship between the US, what it was then and now, is completely transformed. It's our most consequential partner, largest trading partner, largest investment partner, technology partner, largest single country presence of Indian origin diaspora, largest single country presence of Indian origin students in universities. But when they decide on something based on their political compulsion, they expect things to change. Now look at globalization. When it was the unipolar moment, the US wanted to extend its influence all over the world and push for globalization, efficiency in production, new WTO norms. But when 30 to 40% of the US voting population decided that it was not working for them and that they brought in a Trump, today you're not hearing globalization from the US anymore. Now you are hearing of onshoring, reshoring, secure supply chains, taking care of the interest of the worker, and then they'll expect everybody else to fall in line. So I think we have to be aware of the fact that every country will be trying to build narratives, influence events based on their interests, and only when you have a measure of capacity to take your own decisions that you can protect your interests. And I think, again, I believe that we are doing certainly more and more with the US and Europe. And one reflection is that we are building a very strong partnership with France. And within the Western system, France tries to maintain some autonomy of its decision-making. And building that partnerships gives us also a measure of autonomy of decision-making, even as we build closer with US and Europe.
Ambassador Saran on environment.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, the climate change agenda in the face of what we are seeing pales into insignificance at this point, because I think we are in a state of a global crisis. Russia has never been an important systemic player in the climate change negotiations. the last agreements that were held, that were arrived at, were fundamentally a compact between the United States and China, and they expected everyone else to fall in line. So it was, in fact, a very vivid example of US-China cooperation with disregard for most of the other countries. To the extent that oil prices go up and fossil fuel becomes more expensive, I was told that the normal conventional wisdom is that when oil goes above $100, then the impulses for finding alternative sources of energy also rise, because then there is a case that you should invest, and then higher costs of alternative and renewable energy sources become more viable. So I would just leave it at that, because Russia by itself, it's a country of 140 million people. It's not a great polluter in the world. It uses its energy resources, fossil fuel resources, as its assets for leveraging. And of course, the world has got addicted to fossil fuel, including Europe. And we, by the way, for our own energy diversification, have in the last few years moved very fast to source energy from Russia, both in terms of oil and gas. And this was to reduce our dependence on the Middle East, which was, in any case, in the midst of a massive geopolitical crisis. And it has always been. So maybe I just leave it there. But I have some thoughts on some of the other aspects which we can come to.
Let me just pick out a few more questions and then I'll come back. And Professor Raja Mohan, so will $100 oil lead to more drilling or to more switch to renewables?
No, I think it is going to be a big crisis. I think for us, just when our economy seemed to take off, that the price in oil, I mean, I think the finance minister has repeatedly said the uncertainty that this war is going to introduce to India's economic growth, I mean, is a real one. And more important, I think, since we're talking about Russia, Russia is not only a producer of oil, it's a producer of all major commodities, strategic commodities in the world today. And therefore, isolating Russia will have significant consequences, not just for India. In fact, Europe's dependence on Russian energy is huge. So how this gets managed is going to be a major problem. And I think this probably where Putin miscalculated that given the interdependence, the West would not get to this far, or that he thought he could get away with it. But I want to say one important thing. This narrative that Russia was pushed for innocent Russia, the nuclear weapon power, got pushed by the West into doing a conflict that it does not want. Look, this is a great power, has been around for a long time. It was a choice that Putin made. So it is not you're pushed into something you don't want to do. Putin made a calculation. It's gone terribly wrong for Russia. That this everybody has problems in the world. That's what sovereignty is about, right? You have to if you make a mistake in judgment, if you make a mistake, you will get punished. That is the real world. In the world of multiple sovereigns, you make an error and you can say, look, oh, I was nice guy, they misled me. Whether you are a fool taken for a ride, or you are, fundamentally, wrong in thinking about the world. In the end, the consequences are the same. So I think there's no point hopping on whether he was pushed or did he jump. And I think he made a choice and he'll have to face the consequences. I think that is the second. I think I just want to give a comparison between the Russian obsession with NATO and how China has dealt with the American alliances in Asia. That is, if you go back to Mao Zedong, unlike Russia, China's People's Liberation Army fought the Americans in the Korean Peninsula in 1950 to 53. Thousands of Chinese died. 18 years later, he's making a deal with the Americans. And then Deng Xiaoping comes and says, put your head down. We need to grow. Let's work with the West. So he sucked in Western capital, built himself up from $100 per capita economy to the second largest economy. And today he's pushing back against the Americans. But Russia's things, look, it was a great power before. It was a nuclear power. It was in the UNSC. It was the equal in the Second World War. You won that lost glory with a very limited economic resources. And I think that is where the fundamental strategic grievance of Russia, that we were great once, and I have nuclear weapon powers, therefore I'm going to leverage that. to get a better place in the order. Look, I think that's where nothing comes for free. I mean, and I think that's where the lack of an economy puts Russia in a terrible place. And you need to cut your cloth, which is what Deng Xiaoping told you. Exploit the situation to your advantage.
So now I'm going to change track a bit. I'm going to take questions from Satish, from Kiran, and from Pallavi. And then I'm going to give it to all of you because we've got about 15 minutes left. If we keep the questions brief, then I will be able to, give you all about 5-6 minutes to respond.
Madhur Bajaj also.
Okay.
Madhur Bajaj.
Yeah. So, and that's so Satish, Kiran, Pallavi, and Madhur Bajaj. And could we just ask the questions? Could you start?
Sure. Thank you, everybody. It's a fascinating discussion so far. So question is straight to Professor Raja Mohan. I also, just like you, generally read his columns very, very diligently. And I think partly he has addressed this question, but I still want to ask this part of it. This is more about, what seems to be a nightmare scenario. It's like where he said that, Russia becomes a junior partner to China post this whole thing, the way it comes out. The issue is implications for India in that case, because that's where the nightmarish part comes in, because of the conflict that India has with China on the border and also on the left side with Pakistan. It's more about the implications, and what would be the solutions, what would be the options, let me put it that way, that India would have in that kind of a nightmare scenario.
Okay. Kiran?
Thank you, Janmajay, and great discussion. Just a couple of comments very, very briefly, and I'd love to hear reactions if there's time from the panelists. First, global experience shows that sanctions don't work. It puts the country and the people to great difficulty, but they never created regime change. Be it Cuba from decades ago, or be it Iran, and I don't expect much to happen in Russia. We faced sanctions after 1999, and that may have been the only successful case where we were pushed, cajoled, or persuaded to sign up a deal with the US. But beyond that, sanctions don't work, so I'm not sure that's going to work. Therefore, to Janmajay, your point, the question is, will this work? Will it send a different message to China, in fact? That look, sanctions, we'll handle them. Every country does, number one. Number two, very briefly, the biggest winners, I think, have been probably China, because the US and European Western attention has shifted to Europe, and probably the US shale companies, the question on oil going above $100. Germany is going to cut Nord Stream 2. Europe will be pushed or want to not buy Russian fossil fuels. And their option then is to import from Middle East or from the US. Costly shale oil from the US will certainly make its way there. With oil above $100, that's great for them. We are big losers because this is going to push Russia closer to China. And our dependable arms supplier who gave us arms that the US refused time and again is going to be cut off. And our ability to bargain, to balance the two is going to reduce because Russia, you're right, is going to be a diminished power after this. Though the sanctions may not have the impact, it will impact their economy. Finally, I do think that the terrible mistake that Putin did make by sending his troops into Ukraine is going to rebound on him. But his hope may well be that he will pull out quickly, unlike learning the lesson from Afghanistan, on the understanding that Ukraine stays neutral. Whether it will work or no is questionable. But just a side comment on that, and I think both Ambassador Arun Singh and Ambassador Saran mentioned this in their own ways obliquely. The West, and the US in particular, has not been dependable in terms of assurances for expansion of NATO. So it may well be that Putin genuinely believed or had information that Ukraine was about to suddenly be admitted into NATO, and he took preemptive action. But that doesn't matter. The fact is, if they stay there, they'll get bogged down like Afghanistan. If they withdraw quickly, which I hope they will, it can only be on some kind of assurance, which we, in our own interest, should both promote and hope for, because if not, we are going to be in deep trouble. We import a lot from Russia, oil, fertilizers, gas. We depend on them not just for arms, but more importantly, for defense technology, which nobody, including the Americans, give us. Remember, the Americans didn't even give us armed drones, as far as I know. And with the Russians, we have worked jointly on the technology for a supersonic missile. So just comments on where we are would be of great interest in this whole situation. Are we one of the biggest losers in this whole battle, which is happening so far from our shores? Thank you.
Pallavi?
Well, I had very similar thoughts as, I mean, obviously not with the same erudition. Simply speaking, are we really standing on two banana peels? And if I had to believe Professor Raja Mohan, it looks like things are not going to go Putin's way. The reality is that we have, the Chinese, we share the Chinese border. We've seen aggression. We've seen China's aggression throughout all its neighbors, and it will embolden them. What would the world do if we are not supporting protection of a democracy and an illegal invasion, not standing against an illegal invasion of a country?
Great. Mr. Bandar Bajaj has disappeared.
No, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm very much here.
Okay. Next, your serial number 28 petitioner, which is throwing me off.
That was my last. I was attending the court the other day, so that has remained somehow. But of course, you guys know me by face. So could I start with my queries?
Yes.
Thank you, Janmejay, for serving us such a credible panel. Thank you for that. My queries are as follows. The other day, just day before yesterday, I read an article of Shekhar Gupta where he's talking about the present situation of Ukraine. And he says Ukraine had strategic weapons, including nuclear weapons, which they gave up because America and Russia also, apart from other countries, promised them that if there's any attack on Ukraine, they will defend it. All right. Now, if they are not able to do it, and they are not being able to do it, in fact, one of them is attacking it, the faith of countries on global powers will disappear. I'm afraid of that. One. Second is regarding the targeting of civilians. Russia's, okay, there is a collateral damage when you try to hit the army. Sometimes it falls on civilians also, some of the bombs. But here they are bombing hospitals and homes and all. Now that is not only isolating them, other than China and Pakistan, from other countries, but also the Russian themselves are not liking what their president is doing, and he could face a problem from within the Russians. Again, what does the panel think? And last, I believe that it is not going to end in Ukraine. I believe he's got a bigger agenda, Putin, of re-establishing a new USSR, Soviet Union. And therefore, he will go beyond Ukraine for other countries so that he can make the Soviet bloc once again, a new Soviet bloc. What does the panel think? Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, Vineet, if you wanted to add 1 minute, I see you have been posting on the chat and I can't read it. So if you have a crisp question to add, then I will throw that all to the panelists and I'll allow them to answer whichever parts they want and which they don't want, they need not. That will be their choice. But, Vineet, I can't see you either, but I've seen many comments on chat. I don't think he's there. Okay, so, I get a thrill sometimes about having a career which I don't have, of being like a Zakaria, giving everyone 30 seconds and 1 minute, etc. But I'm going to go and give everyone 2 minutes to answer whichever parts of the questions that were there. Does junior partner to China make it very difficult for India? Sanctions don't work. China is a winner. US is a winner. India is a loser. what impact on India, and then the questions of Mr. Bajaj. And Dilip, you're saying I missed something else coming on chat. But anyways, let's now go and let me change the order. Professor Raja Mohan, you go first, then Professor Saran, and then I'll give the last word to Ambassador Singh. You'll have to unmute, Professor Mohan.
No, I think the one question that was specifically asked to me on the junior partner stuff. Look, I think the direction of Russia getting closer to China has been there. And as my two friends here, Delhi has always watched very closely the state of China-Russia relationship, going back to my Gorbachev years. So for us, I think it is something they know. And what we've seen happen is the idea in February 4th that they can come together is a different stage of that evolution. And I think it is there. And my sense is, as I said, the principal consequence for us is the jugalbandi that they can do vis-a-vis India. One guy can ramp up military pressure anytime he wants. And at this point, you have no one but to go to the Russians for weapons. So I think this is a terrible situation to be caught in. And the question, that's where I think the CII comes in. Do what you can to ramp up domestic defense production. That's the only way to get out of this logjam that we're in. And finally, I just want to say a word about nuclear weapons. That in a way that the Abe-sans talk about Japan hosting nuclear weapons, or some in Ukraine saying they need nuclear weapons. Somebody in South Korea is the same debate. The South Korean elections are due. There again, there is a nuclear debate. That nuclear weapons are back in a very interesting way. For in Putin's hands, they could be a threat, a blackmail. That final card that he has is the escalation to a nuclear level. While for smaller countries, nuclear weapons remain the principal means to deter a stronger adversary, whether it is South Korea, Japan, or Ukraine. I don't think they're going to be allowed to get it, but I think the Japanese and South Korean case are going to be quite fascinating to follow for us to see where this nuclear debate goes.
Ambassador Saran? You'll have to.
No, yeah, thank you. No, just to, I mean, if you were to imagine an investor who has a certain amount of money and he is investing in a portfolio of different investments, he would spread his risks and he would choose equity and debt and long-term yield and current yield, etc. Similarly, I think in international relations, there are no full stops. And you have to calibrate as you go along. And precisely for all the reasons that have been brought out in terms of our threats, both from China and from, by the way, within our own region, which primarily come from smaller countries because that's all we have, you have to constantly evolve your own position. So absolutism in a multipolarity world is a wrong approach to take. It is simple, it is convenient, it is easy to theorize it, but real life is more difficult. Number one. Number two, clearly, like in 1991, unfortunately, China is again going to be a winner. And now we are more aware of ourselves and of what we learned in 1991. So I am sure we are going to be better prepared. And as Raja Mohan said, on the question of defense manufacturing, etc. But on this also, it's not so easy, but we have to do it. With regard to where we go from here, I think it is a fundamental moment, but the dust is still to settle down. We have to see which way matters proceed. And instead of viewing ourselves all the time as a passive recipient of a change or an external or an autonomous development, I think it is also important to view ourselves as an active player and to see how we can influence not only security in our own country, but around us. And we have to also have an image about ourselves. Are we only going to view ourselves as a small, insignificant, vulnerable victim of other people's games? Or are we going to assert ourselves regionally and globally? And then there may be a situation where we will also have to take actions, protect and promote our security. And this mindset is also very important to keep as we go along. I'll just say that much.
Ambassador Singh, and ending with, is India a loser, and how does it navigate that? But anything else you want to bring up?
So, Janmijay, of course, I think everybody is a loser. US is also going to lose. There are 70,000 jobs in the US linked to trade with Russia. That's going to take a hit. Europe is going to be a loser. The huge trade linkages, energy dependence. Of course, Russia is a loser. China will also be a loser. They have some gains. They have a $147 billion trade with Russia. For much of it, there could be payment-related challenges coming up because the yuan settlements are a very small part of overall China-Russia trade. We will lose, but our trade with Russia is only $10 billion, much less than everyone. So I don't see why we are going to be the biggest loser. And unless it is specifically sanctioned, you can also work out the rupee-ruble arrangement. Your worry is only what happens on defense supplies, especially if the Russia-China relationship deepens. Now, Russia has been supplying weapons to China for more than 2 decades. And so far, from what I see in the public domain, India has no concern that on account of China, Russia has held back on any defense supplies to India, including in the context of what happened at the LSE last year. So unless that changes, I don't think we are the biggest loser. So I don't think we should exaggerate our worries on that account. The other point I'd like to make is that there is going to be another big push for supply chain reordering. It started with the trade challenge from China, got another push with COVID, and now what's happening with Russia. There'll be a major supply chain reordering. And I think all of us should look for that opportunity. That what is going to happen, where do we plug in, how do we take advantage of that, how do we get involved in the debates on norms and standards right from the beginning, rather than coming in at a later stage when positions are frozen. And again, as part of this, and we've had discussions on this, there are new trends in critical and emerging technologies. AI, quantum, cyber, 6G, biotech space. We should look at that and see in these areas, how do we plug into the critical and emerging technologies rather than, just focusing on what the disruption that is happening because, whatever is as a result of Russia. And then I think, this point about whether we are going to suffer reputational damage because of being little careful on how we are addressing the Russia challenge. In the past, every country looks at it from the point of view of its interests. If you look at the West on the Israel-Palestine issue, they can be criticized for the kind of positions they have taken, especially the US. If you looked at US position or UK position on South Africa at the time of apartheid, for years they stayed with that because they saw that as their position. So people will build narratives to generate pressure on us. I think what we need to do is build the counter narrative to explain our position, and policymakers do understand that. But I think this game will certainly go on. And the final point I'd say is that because of whatever we need to do, keeping in mind our interests with Russia, one way of dealing with all this challenge is to be even more proactive in the context of the Indo-Pacific and Quad and others, which will highlight to the US and others that we remain very relevant to their strategies in this part of the world. And I think that will soften some of the criticism that we may face on account of the Russia relationship.
Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion. I really want to thank Ambassador Singh, Ambassador Saran, and Professor Raja Mohan. The understanding of the foreign policy imperatives, the Indian narrative, how to deal with this, who will win, who will lose. That's really been quite an education, I would imagine, for all of us. There is one nagging fear which I still have, which is totally economic, which is with, commodity prices rising, with divestment slowing down, what will happen to our fisc, what will happen to inflation and interest rates. But that, I think, is one of these unprecedented things that comes around all the time. But having said that, it's been a really educative discussion. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege to moderate this. Marut, unless you have anything else to say, I will close this now.
We can close this, Dr. Sinha. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.